This is going to be your complete guide to integrating NextAuth v5 with Next.js app router, server, and client components. So NextAuth, now known as Auth.js, has released this NextAuth at 5-beta package that is going to more easily integrate with the latest version of Next.js. Now, it seems like they're rebranding to Auth.js because they're becoming runtime agnostic and you don't need to necessarily use their package within Next.js. And it looks like they're providing support for other frameworks and everything so that you can use it more kind of generally, not just in Next.js. But today we're going to cover Authentication Next.js. We're going to build out a demo application to where we're going to use session management in client and server components and show you the mechanics of how this works. Now, if I head over to the docs on Next.js here, what you're going to see here is we'll of course have to follow this installation guide. And then we also have several options for authentication. So we have OAuth, magic links, using credentials like an email and password, using WebAuth. So this would be like using passkeys. And then from there, we can also integrate with a database. So you can see NextAuth has these different adapters for all of the popular databases. And then here it gives you some guides regarding session management. So sign in, sign out, get session, protecting resources and all that stuff. So in today's video, we're going to focus on installation, authentication. We're going to use OAuth with GitHub, and then we're going to do some session management as well. And in kind of part 2 of this, we're going to look at integrating NextAuth with a database. So that's going to be coming, but in part 2 of this kind of guide. So let's go back to installation here and just kind of start at the top. Make sure that you are selected on Next.js here because that is what we're going to use. So first things first, I'm going to head over to VS Code, and within the terminal, I'm going to run npx create -next-app at latest. And then I'm going to name this next-auth v5. Not going to use TypeScript, no ESLint, yes to Tailwind, although we're not really focusing on styles. So you don't need to do this. It's not going to be critical for this course of understanding how the v5 version of NextAuth works. We're not going to use SRC. We are going to use app router, and we're not going to customize the default import alias. So this project is going to get created, and then I'm going to do file open and then open this project within VS Code. So we're here with our kind of fresh project here. I will make sure to link the final code in the description below in case you need to reference anything there. But what we're going to do here first is head back to the NextAuth docs. We first need to install NextAuth at beta, and I'm using npm, so that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to copy that, open the terminal, paste that in, npm install NextAuth at beta. And then I'm going to install this. Everything looks good there. So now I'm going to start setting up the environment. So to do this, we need to create the .env.local file. So let's come back, and in the root of our application, so on the same level as our package.json, our next.config.mjs, we're going to create a new file, and it's going to be .env.local. Now, as I go here, I'm going to be blacking out all of my secrets and stuff just for security reasons, but you should still see enough to understand what's kind of going on. So I'm going to now come back after creating that, and we need to generate an auth secret. And the way we can do this is using npx auth secret. And then we need to add that as an auth secret in our .env.local file. So I'm going to copy npx auth secret to generate a new auth secret. I'm going to paste that here. And you're going to see, well, you're not going to see, but you should see auth secret equals, and then some kind of string of characters. I'm going to go ahead and copy this whole thing. And then I'm going to go ahead and clear my terminal so I can stop blacking that out. And then I'm going to paste the auth secret within my .env.local file and then do Command S to save. And then I'm going to close that file just so I don't have to keep blacking it out. It's going to be easier for me when I'm editing this later on. So we've set up our auth secret. Moving down to the next step. Now we have to configure. So it says create an auth.js config file and object. This is where you can control the behavior. And interesting that they spell behavior O-U-R. Is that like a British thing? I kind of think it is. But that's where you control the behavior of the library and specify custom auth logic, adapters, etc. We recommend all frameworks to create this file in the project, and then they'll pass all options to the framework-specific initialization function, and then export the route handler, sign-in, sign-out methods, and more. So basically, you can have these handlers all in one place. So we are going to come back in the root of our application. We're going to create an auth.js file, and then within this file, we are just going to copy and paste this line of code here, but we'll customize this here in a second. But for now, go ahead and copy, come back, and paste this in here. If you're not like using the NextAuth docs and you're kind of typing this out as we go ahead and pause this and you can finish kind of typing this out if needed. But I'm going to continue on to the next step here. We need to add a route handler under app/API/auth, and then a catch-all route that is at /route.js. And it says this must be under the app router route handler. So let's go ahead and create this. Let me see if I can remember the path. App API auth, and then a catch-all NextAuth. App API auth. So with an app, let's create a new folder. That's going to be API. And then with API, let's create a new folder called auth. And then within auth, let's create another new folder. That's going to be a catch-all route. So left square bracket, .. And I think it was NextAuth, closed square bracket. And let me make sure it is indeed NextAuth. And then we need to create a route.js file within that catch-all route of NextAuth. So I'm going to do route.js. So here you should see within app, API folder, auth folder, NextAuth catch-all route denoted by the square brackets as well as the 3 dots before NextAuth, and then a route.js file. We need to import handlers from our auth file that we just created, and then we need to export get and post from those handlers. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this and paste it within this route file. So again, if you need to pause right now, go ahead and do so you can type this all out. We can now add optional middleware to keep the session alive, which we are going to do. So we need to create a middleware.js file and then put this code in it. And this is going to help update the session every time it's called, so our session isn't constantly expiring, which is something that we want here. So I'm going to copy this first, head back to VS Code, and then within the root of our application, and I'm going to close my open editors here, but within the root of our application, so on the same level as like our env file we just created, as well as our auth.js file we just created, I'm going to create a new file, and this is going to be middleware.js, and then I'm going to paste in export auth as middleware from @/auth. So this @ sign here is saying from the root of our application and our auth folder. So right here, it's importing this auth function right here from NextAuth into our middleware and exporting it as middleware. And that is going to kind of be a wrapper that's going to help keep our session alive and means that we don't have to manage a lot of that ourselves. So now let's head back and continue down the steps. So now we need to set up authentication methods. So really, we've done everything we need to do to kind of set up or install and configure NextAuth within our project. But now we need to head over to authentication. So we're going to do OAuth here, and we're going to select GitHub. And then for this, the first thing that we're going to have to do is register an OAuth app in GitHub's dashboard. So I'm going to go over to github.com. If you don't have a GitHub, and you're like starting out, I would highly recommend you creating a GitHub account. It's going to be super useful, but I'm guessing most of you already have one. But if you don't, go ahead and create a free GitHub account. And then once you do that, select your icon in the top right and go to settings, which is right here. And then scroll all the way down and you'll see developer settings. And then within developer settings, we're going to generate or click on new GitHub app. And then we're going to name this app. I'm going to name it next-auth v5. And then our homepage URL, well, for now, it's just going to be localhost 3000. So http://localhost:3000. And then we also need to add a callback URL. So our base URL is going to be our localhost 3000. But then heading back to NextAuth here, this is going to be our callback URL. So when registering an OAuth application on GitHub, they will ask you to enter your application's callback URL. So let's copy /API/auth/callback/GitHub, and then go back to our app that we're registering. And I'm going to paste that in here. So our callback URL is going to be localhost 3000 /API/auth/callback/GitHub. And then I'm going to scroll down. We are not going to have webhooks active, so I'm going to uncheck that. And then we're going to select create GitHub app. And then after doing so, you're going to have a client ID, and we're also going to generate a secret. But let's go ahead and move forward in the Auth.js docs here. And we're going to scroll down. We're going to see the next step is adding an auth GitHub ID as well as an auth GitHub secret. So I'm going to copy these, head back to VS Code, go to the .env.local file, and below our auth secret, I'm going to paste in auth GitHub ID as well as auth GitHub secret. So our auth GitHub ID, this is going to be within this new app that we just created on GitHub. That's going to be this client ID right here at the top. And I'm probably blurring mine out or blacking it out, but you should still see my cursor right here. It's this client ID. And then I'm going to come back and I'm going to paste that within my .env.local file. So it should read auth GitHub ID is equal to whatever ID you're seeing here within your newly generated app. But now we need to generate a client secret. So I'm going to click generate a new client secret. And then you should see a new client secret pop up. And then you should see this little copy icon that I'm going to click on, head back to VS Code, and then paste that as the auth GitHub secret. And I've done so there. And then I'm going to close my .env.local file. And now I'm back here at the NextAuth docs. So that should connect Next.js to our new GitHub app. But now we need to set up our provider. So in our auth file or auth.js file, we need to now add a provider's property to calling our NextAuth function here. And we need to set it as an array with GitHub within it. And GitHub should be imported from NextAuth provider's GitHub. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this here, the provider's property as well as GitHub. I'm going to come back to our auth.js file. And I can see I already have the provider's property. So I'm going to just type in GitHub here. I'm going to need to import that from NextAuth provider's GitHub. So I'm going to copy this import, come back and make sure we have this imported here. So this is setting a GitHub provider within our NextAuth application flow here. And now we'll come back and now we can just add a sign in button. So heading back to VS Code, I'm going to create a components folder within my app directory called components. And then I'm going to create a sign in function. So I'm going to do sign in.jsx, and I'm going to export a function called sign in. And then we are going to return just a div. And I'm going to add just a little bit of styling to this in a second. And then we're going to use a form because we're going to use a server action here. And our action is going to be open up curly braces, and I'm going to select return. It is going to be an async anonymous function. So the parentheses, arrow, and then another set of curly braces. And I'm going to say use server. So you could create an actions file and create your server actions there this time around, just because I haven't done this a lot in my tutorials and this is what NextAuth's shown. I figured we would just take this route. So we're going to put use server at the top of this function, saying this is a server action. And then we are going to await calling our sign in function, importing that from @/auth, our auth.js file that we just created. So we're exporting the sign in function from NextAuth here, and we're importing that into our sign in function. So we're going to await sign in, and then we're going to pass in GitHub. So it's basically saying sign in with our GitHub provider. And then within this form, we're going to do an H2 that says sign in. And then we're going to do a button that is going to be of type submit. So since it's type submit, it is going to trigger our form action. And it's just going to say sign in with GitHub. Now I'm going to add just a few styles to this so it doesn't look completely horrendous, but really you probably wouldn't need to add styles to this, but I would say feel free to just copy and paste my styles from my repo that I've linked below, and it's going to make this look quite a bit better. So I'm going to just paste those in there. Nothing else changed here. We're still using this use server, awaiting sign in with GitHub, sign in, everything else is the same here. I guess this changed to .js, but it doesn't need to be. It can just be @/auth. So now I'll head back, and basically it says ship it. Click sign in with GitHub and see if it works. So let's go ahead and head back to VS Code and run npm run dev and see if we get any errors here. So it looks like it's compiled. So I'm going to go to localhost, and I see just our kind of base Next.js template here. We actually never even added the route for signing in. So let's actually go ahead and do that now. So we have this sign in component, but we need to render out a sign in page. So let's create a new folder within our app directory, sign-in, and then let's create a page.jsx file within it and do export a default function sign in page. And this is really just going to be a wrapper around our sign in component. We probably didn't need to create the own component, and we could have just made it a page in of itself, which would be a very reasonable thing to do if you decided to do that. But sometimes having a wrapper page component is helpful. So now we should be able to go to /sign in and see our sign in component here. So let's give that a try, /sign in, and we see sign in with GitHub. So I'm going to click on this, and we should see this, which is good. I'm going to click authorize NextAuth v5, and it redirects me back to localhost 3000 and my sign-in page, which this actually isn't great UX to just, bring us back to our sign-in page, but we could fix this. How do I know if that worked or not? Well, what we can do is heading back to the NextAuth docs. I'm going to zoom out a little bit here. This is where we want to get into session management. So we have our sign in. We're going to need to add a sign out button, but first we need to know if we're logged in or not. So let's first get the session. So to do this, what we need to do is we need to import auth from our auth.js file, and then we can call that function. So calling auth, we can get our session and then check session.user. So let's come back to VS Code and let's just go to our homepage here. I'm going to rename this to JSX just because we're returning JSX, and I just frankly like the icon better. You know that if you've seen my videos, but I'm going to say const session is equal to await, and we're going to need to make this an async function, which is okay to do in server components, which this is. We need to call the auth function from @auth, and then I'm just going to console.log our session. And we should see that within our console down here since this is running server side. So if we come back to our just localhost 3000, so not on our sign-in page, our home page, it renders out. And if I check, I can see we're console logging this session that has a user, a name, and an image. So it does look like we logged this user in. I logged myself in because this is my GitHub username. So what I can do here is maybe within this div, I'll just open up a pair of curly braces and I'll say session ? Dot user ? Dot name. And if that is true, so ampersand, render in H2, it just says hello. And then I will render out this session user name. So if my logic is correct here, we should see hello code Ryan Solomon here. So that works. We're able to get our session. I still need to show you integrating with client components, but we're able to get our session here, which is pretty dang cool. So now we still have a couple of other things to do. For one, let's implement a sign out button. So to do this, let's click sign in and sign out for session management. You can see that for sign in and sign out, we're going to scroll down to sign out. And we could do this within a server component and using a server action, just like we did for sign in. But we can also do it as a client component. Just for the sake of variety here, let's do it within a client component here. So we are going to need to import sign out from NextAuth /React. That is what we need to do for client components here. It says, again, in a client component, you can use the NextAuth /React imports as they are marked with the use client directive. Let's create this sign out button here and sign out from NextAuth /React. So I'm going to come back to VS Code, and within our components folder, I'm going to create a sign out button.jsx, and then we're going to make this a client component. And then I'm going to export a default function sign out button. And then we're just going to return a very simple button that says sign out. Although eventually we'll have to decide if we want this button to be sign out or sign in, but we'll cover that in a second. And then on click here, we're going to pass a function that calls sign out, but it's not going to be from our @auth folder. It's going to be from NextAuth React since this is a client component. So I'm going to copy that, paste that under use client, and then we're going to use sign out like so. And now within our page here, let's render this maybe at the end here. So I'll do sign out button, and we'll render that kind of at the end of our front header. If I come back to localhost, we should see this sign out button now. And if I click on this, I shouldn't see much happening, although I shouldn't see this anymore, the hello code Ryan Solomon. So I'm going to click on it, and I don't see it anymore. But as you can see, I still see sign out. And really, if the user is signed out, this should just be like a link to the sign in page. So let's do that. Instead of just rendering this all the time, let's do session ? And the reason we're doing this is because it's going to prevent an error. If I just did like session.user ? Well, session might be undefined and it might throw an error. I'll actually just show you this. But we'll do session. If there's a user within our session, then that means we should show the sign out button. Man, that was a tongue twister. But let me paste that here. But if that's not true, let's just render out a link from next/link. And this is going to be sign in. And the href is going to be to the sign in page. So if there's a session user, like I said, this I think is going to error right now if there's not a session, because it's going to try to access an undefined object. But if there is a user, render the sign out button. else render a link to go sign in. So we see cannot read properties of null, reading user. We need to use the optional chaining here and putting session ? .user. And then now we should be good to go. So now we see this sign in button, which should take us to our sign in page. So I'll click sign in with GitHub. And this time around, it should have happened already because it doesn't need to take us through that whole flow again since we already said, hey, our app is good. So if I go to my homepage here, I should see my user signed in, which I do see, hello, Code Ryan Solomon, and I see sign out. But that sign-in experience is pretty terrible. So the way that we can fix that is within our sign-in page, what we can do is we can do the same thing. We can say const session is equal to auth, importing that from @/auth. And I can say if session ? .user, if there's a user that's logged in, then I'm going to call the redirect function from next navigation, and we're just going to push them to the home page. So we're not going to render out this sign-in page, just redirect them to the home page. So if there's a session user, redirect to the home page. So if I go to, I'm going to sign out, I'm going to go to sign in, click sign in with GitHub, and something didn't work there. So let's see, did I get any errors in my console? What I think I forgot to do here is I didn't await this call to auth. So I need to do an async function. And now if I come back, I'm at my homepage. Let's try this again. Sign out, sign in with GitHub, and it redirects me back to my homepage. And you could of course show like a toast message saying sign in successfully. So we have a decent like sign in, sign out workflow, but there's one more thing I want to show you before we move on to integrating with databases. And that is using sessions within client. We already saw from the docs here that you need to use NextAuth React to integrate like signing in and signing out from client components. Well, what if we just want to use like get session? Well, within a server component, we can just use async and then await auth. Within a client component, what you need to do is you actually need to render out a session provider and then have your session as a value within the session provider. And then you can use session within your client components. Now, there's probably going to be times to where you might need to do this, but here's what I would recommend trying to do if possible, or whenever possible, is let's close the terminal. And, I'm going to show it this way, but just know if you absolutely need to, you can still use the use session and passing it as context like you normally would in like a client application. The way I would do this in Next.js app router and using server components is let's just create another component here. And I'm going to just say client example.jsx. So just a basic client component. It's going to be use client here at the top. Export a default function called client example. And then we'll just return a p tag that just says client example. What if we wanted to use a session within this client component? Well, I think the easiest way is to just pass it as a prop. So say you need to get the user and know if they're like logged in or logged out. I'm going to just expect a prop called user. And I'll just, for now, well, maybe I'll say client example, and then I'll say user name is, and then we'll do user dot name. I think it was the name property on the user. If I come back to our root page, and it was the name property on the user, so that's good. But what I'm going to do is below this div, we're going to render out our client example. And then all we need to do here to give this client component access is pass the user as a prop. So I'm going to say user is equal to session ? dot user. Now, one thing to be careful of is sometimes this is going to be undefined. So in our client example, we should actually say user ?name, or I'll just say no user, and we'll render out like that because we need to have that check because user might be undefined in certain times. But if I come back to localhost here and I see client example, username is Code Ryan Solomon. So we're seeing that we are passing the user as a prop to our client components from server components. I think that's probably the best way to use sessions within client components is passing them as props from server components, or at least the easiest way. But you might need to go this route as well with context and use session. But I think that in most cases, this should be pretty well fine, especially if you're following the principles of, using client components as leaf components and trying to keep the bulk of your app as a server component. So here we can see that it's using it correctly. I'll click sign out, and now we say username, no user. So that gets updated like we expect. Sign in with GitHub. It loads, redirects us back to the homepage, and we have properly implemented authentication with NextAuth v5 within Next.js app router. Now, we've done session management, we've installed it, we've connected it to OAuth, but you're most likely still going to want to integrate this with a database. So that is what we're going to do in the next video of this NextAuth guide.